Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Impartation Moment on Tuesday Night Anatomy with Daniel Okwan. Today's section, I want to quickly review some histological aspects regarding the tongue, which is an important structure of the oral cavity. But precisely, I'll be dwelling more looking at the histology of what we call the lingual papillae. In fact, these lingual papillae, they are correctly called primary lingual papillae, because I'll show you that even within these primary papillae, which are these mucosal elevations we find on the dorsum of the tongue, anterior two thirds of the dorsum of the tongue, what happens is that within them, we also have connective tissue papillae, serving as secondary papillae. So I'll show you that. Of course, we know the various functions of the tongue, very important in suckling, during neonatal life. Of course, not only that, because of that flared nature of what we call filiform papillae, helping that kind of mechanical digestion, helping in actually mastication. Of course, talking about mixing food with saliva, very important, because at the end of the day, these the tongue itself is going to have these kind of minor salivary glands, being of course basically lingual glands, which of course we find them in the submucosa of this kind of tongue we are talking about. Yes, not only that, it helps in positioning of course food in between the teeth, very important. Yes, helping in forming bolus from that kind of morsel of food that you've taken. Okay, very important in that one. Of course, not only that, after eating the food that is left in the teeth, yes, of course they are actually cleansed with the help of the tongue. But very important, yes, not only in kissing, but also in articulation of sounds in speech. Very important. And that is why those who present with shorter lingua frenula, they tend to experience this kind of tight tongue, which clinically is referred to as ankyloglossia. And so without much ado, let's look at this histological aspect regarding the tongue. So there we are. Let's look into some bit of gross aspect. So when you look at the tongue, yes, this time right, we are looking at the dorsal aspect of the tongue, such that we are looking at the superior portion of the tongue. Now the lower aspect, which I'll show you, is the inferior portion, which we call the ventral aspect of the tongue. Now if we talk about the tongue will actually present with three main areas. We talk about the roots of the tongue, we talk about the body of the tongue, and we talk about the tip or the apex of what we call the tongue. Now remember that if you talk about the root of the tongue is actually extends into the oropharynx, okay, and that's why we also call it the pharyngeal component of the tongue. And this portion, which is over here, that root of the tongue usually we refer to as the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and precisely the bones that it is sandwiched between is actually the hyoid bone and of course the mandible. Now, one thing that you know is that because it forms part of this kind of floor of the oral cavity, that makes sense that it is formed between the hyoid bone, okay, that bone which is not having any articulation with any other bone in there, and as well as of course the mandible, not the maxilla, the mandible. Because mandible is actually the lower jaw, okay, forms the lower jaw. So that is what we find. Now if you look at the root of the tongue, now immediately behind the root of the tongue I have this epiglottis, that kind of elastic cartilage of the larynx. Okay, so over there now what we find is that there's a fold. There are two folds that we find, two groups of folds that we find. One of them, okay, is called the median glossoepiglottic fold. Yes, median because it's found in the midline, okay, and it's between of course the tongue, posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and of course the epiglottis. So median glossoepiglottic fold. Not only do we have median glossoepiglottic fold, because even lateral to this kind of median one, we have what we call lateral. Okay, there are two lateral glossoepiglottic folds, and in between, this kind of median and lateral glossoepiglottic folds will be what we call the valleculae. So valleculae will be present between, of course, the median and the lateral glossoepiglottic folds. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I want you to know is that you should not confuse this lateral glossoepiglottic fold, where it's just lateral to the median glossoepiglottic fold, with of course what we call the palatoglossal arch. Because this palatoglossal arch, okay, is something we call the anterior pillar of forces. Okay, this palatoglossal arch is known as what we call anterior pillar of forces. Sorry, the posterior pillar of forces, because it's more posterior. And then of course there's another pillar of force which we call it the anterior pillar of forces, being the palatoglossal arch. palatoglossal arch. In between them, somewhere between them, is what we call, the tonsillar fossa, which of course the lingual tonsil is going to be found. Sorry, palatine tonsil is going to be found. Okay, palatine tonsil. Now, one thing that you have to know is that in the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, which we are talking about the root of the tongue, we have this kind of mucosal elevations over here. Okay, forming this kind of giving this kind of cobblestone-like appearance. Okay, that one over here. So that is what we call the lingual what do you call it? The lingual follicles. Okay, these kind of mucosal elevations over here. So what I'm trying to show you is that if I look at the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, that is where the root of the tongue is, and this root of the tongue over there, there's a median fold, which we call median glossoepiglottic fold. Then even lateral to that one, we have two lateral glossoepiglottic folds. Now in between the median and lateral glossoepiglottic folds, we have what we call the valleculi, okay, over here. And then even lateral to that one, we are going to have the posterior pillar of forces being the palatopharyngeal arch or palatopharyngeal fold. Okay, and then even anterior to that, we are going to have the palatoglossal fold. We are talking about the palate. We know the palate forms what we call the roof of the oral cavity. So from the palate all the way to the tongue, there's a fold. Okay, and then from the palate all the way to the pharynx, okay, the oropharynx, okay, that portion too, there's going to be a fold, and in between them there's that kind of fossa, which of course the palatine tonsil dwells. Okay, and I said in the posterior 1/3 we are going to have this kind of cobblestone-like appearance, giving this kind of mucosal elevations over here, full of lymphatic nodules. Okay, that is what we find. And then beyond that, now one thing that we find that in the body, before I get to the body, or the oral portion, which forms what we call the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, what I see is that there's a primitive sulcus over here, which we call a sulcus terminalis. Now this sulcus terminalis, ventral to sulcus terminalis, we see this kind of V-shaped area. Okay, and these are the valate or the circumvallate papillae. Circumvallate papillae, you see them, circumvallate papillae, very important. And then moving away from that, now if the meeting point of these two sulcus terminalis, okay, which you find over here, is the foramen cecum. Now this foramen cecum represents that kind of primitive pathway for the thyroid diverticulum to migrate into what we call the neck region, and of course go and reside over there. So if this one fails to close, then of course that schist, thyroglossal schist, may form. Okay, so that is the foramen cecum that we find over here. Now if I look at the dorsum of the tongue, I see some papillae, other papillae, apart from these very rounded large papillae that is forming just ventral, just anterior to what we call the sulcus terminalis, okay, in what we call the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, being the valate or circumvallate papillae. What we find is that we have other papillae over here. Now it is these papillae that I'm talking about, we call them primary papillae, because even within them we will have other papillae developing over there, which will be secondary papillae. I'll show you that. So these ones you find over here, they are the fungiform papillae we find over here. Now these papillae, we are going to find these four main papillae. We are talking about the circumvallate papillae. We will see also fungiform papillae. Yes, we also see filiform papillae. Then even in the newborn and also in lower animals, we may see what we call the foliate papillae. Okay, so that one thing that we find is that these ones, most of them will contain taste buds. Yes, these primary papillae I'm talking about will contain taste buds, except that of filiform papillae. For filiform papillae will be keratinized. The remaining papillae over there will be stratified, squamous, non-keratinized epithelium. Now remember that the mouth, the oral cavity over there, these structures are mainly stratified, squamous, non-keratinized epithelium, with the exception of some areas. Okay, so that is what I want you to know. Now if you are going to be stratified, squamous, non-keratinized, then you will have what we call taste buds. But this filiform, which is keratinized, is devoid of what we call taste buds. Now what do we see? If you look on the dorsum of the tongue, okay, of your neighbor, then what you see is that you see those kind of pinkish, reddish structures, rounded things that you find on the oral cavity, on this kind of dorsal aspect of the tongue, anterior to tell the dorsum of the tongue. Those ones are what we call, those ones represent what we call the fungiform papillae. Okay, and of course, if you go behind more, you will see that of the valate papillae. So you can see on the lateral aspect, okay, of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, we find this kind of fungiform papillae. But what happens is that those whitish ones represent what we call the filiform papillae, which have mechanical rule actually. Now you can see that there's another sulcus that we find over here in the midline, which we call the median sulcus. Of course, we know development of the tongue, so if you've not watched the development of the tongue, please get that video link and watch it, because at the end of the day, yes, these lingual swellings, lateral lingual swellings, will have to fuse together, and that point of fusion, yes, is marked by this kind of median sulcus. Okay, that's one thing that I want you to know. Now, one thing that I want you to know is that the body, which I'll show you in the next slide, what happens if I lift it up downwards over there, that's the inferior aspect or the ventral aspect of the tongue, is devoid of these primary papillae. Okay, so that's what you should know. And then even portion of this kind of anterior two-thirds of the tongue, the most pointing aspect, which rests, okay, on what we call the incisor teeth. So for instance, if you are not eating, I mean, it rests in the lower incisor teeth, but when you are eating and want to prevent the food from leaving the oral cavity to the external environment, then what will happen is that this kind of, apex, which is very mobile, will be taken up, yes, and to what we call the upper incisor teeth, rest against those teeth over there, so that the food is kept in what we call the oral cavity. So there we are. If I lift the tongue, then what will happen is that what I'm interested in showing you is that you see that the inferior surface is smooth compared to that of the dorsum. The dorsum is roughened. Okay, so that is the inferior surface of the tongue, which of course is connected downwards, okay, to the floor of the mouth via what we call the lingual frenulum. Just like having the superior and inferior labial frenula, yes, the tongue is also have lingual frenulum. And we said that this frenulum, if it becomes very short, then it may impede speech. It may impede, kissing and other actions which, of course, the tongue plays. And that is in the case of what we call tie tongue. Okay, and that is what we call ankyloglossia. Yes, of course, we've looked at these things like the sublingual caruncle, which of course the submandibular duct will be opening over here. Yes, I mean, these ones are other things that we are looking at. But let's, look at the main thing for the day. So, if you look at the general structure of the tongue, then one thing that you have to know is that the tongue will have, what we call mucosa. Now, if you talk about mucosa is made up of two things, an epithelial lining and what we call connective tissue. And that connective tissue we are talking about is loose connective tissue. Now, please, because the tongue is an oral structure, then when you are asked to tell the epithelial lining, then you tell us that the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium, it will have a lining mucosa, and to be the epithelial lining will therefore be stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium, except in the case of the dorsum of the tongue, where we, of course, will anterior two-thirds of the dorsum of the tongue, where filiform papillae will be keratinized. Okay, so that is one thing that I want you to know. Now, one thing that you know is that one thing which is very striking about any stratified squamous epithelial tissue, whether it is keratinized or non-keratinized, is that you will see that these kind of epithelial, lining, can you see that, will be dipping into the connective. Now, just below, now, epithelial tissues are avascular, and that is why, as a rule, whenever I have epithelial tissue, beneath it, there should be, underlying connective tissue, and that is of loose connective tissue areola, okay? So, to give it that kind of nourishment through diffusion of those molecules via what we call the non-cellular basement membrane. So, this one over here, can you see that the epithelial lining will be dipping in there? And these ones, as they invade the area of the loose connective tissue underlying the lamina propria, then that is what we call epithelial pecs. So these things that you find over here extending into the underlying connective tissue you find over here from the epithelial lining is what we call epithelial pecs. Epithelial pecs. Now these epithelial pecs are very important because you use it to distinguish between some of these primary papillae that I'm talking about. Okay, so you have to know it very well. And then again, as the epithelial lining dips into it, the lamina propria connective tissue over there will also be invading the vicinity of the epithelial lining, and that's what we call connective tissue papillae. So ladies and gentlemen, what am I trying to say? That we are having this kind of a whole mucosal elevation over there on the dorsal aspect of the tongue, okay, and that is what we call primary papillae, because at the end of the day, even within this papillae, okay, we are having connective tissue lamina propria even invading the vicinity of the epithelial lining, giving us secondary papillae, and these secondary papillae are the what we call the connective tissue papillae that I'm talking about. So you can see that the dorsal aspect of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is showing this kind of mucosal elevations, representing what we call the primary papillae of the tongue. But if I transit and come to what we call the inferior aspect or the ventral aspect of the tongue, then what I find is that there are no primary papillae over here. There are no primary papillae over here because this area is smooth. There are no mucosal elevations over here. However, because the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium, what I see is that the epithelial lining invades the vicinity of connective tissue, giving us these peg-like structures, epithelial pegs or epithelial ridges. And then again, we also see that the connective tissue invades what we call the epithelial lining, and giving us this kind of connective tissue papillae. So it tells you that in the dorsum, in the anterior two thirds of the tongue, we have both primary papillae and secondary papillae by way of the connective tissue papillae, which invades the vicinity of the epithelial lining. But in the case of the ventral aspects of the tongue, because we are not having primary papillae, yes, then it makes sense that these ones we have only what we call connective tissue papillae over there. So that's what I want you to know. Now, one striking thing about the tongue is that because an oral structure, and within the oral structures in the oral cavity, whether it's the lip, whether it's the cheek, whether it's the palate, okay, the tongue, these guys are going to have what you call glands. They are going to have glands. And these glands are therefore known as minor salivary glands, because these minor salivary glands will secrete saliva continuously, unlike the major salivary glands, which I say they secrete saliva continually or intermittently, okay, upon appropriate nervous stimulation. The minor salivary glands are secreting saliva continuously, okay, to ensure that the oral cavity is moist all the time. Now, what I want you to know is that you can see some of these glands, some of them are pale staining. Those ones are mucous in nature. Those ones which are deeply stained, they are what you call, serous in nature. So it means the tongue is having both serous and mucous, minor salivary glands, okay, within it. Now, what you find very striking is that, yes, we have what we call, these glands will be found in the submucosa of the gland. Now, in the oral cavity structures, if you talk about glands or minor salivary glands you're talking about, which are not discrete, which are embedded in these oral structures, then one thing that you have to know is that they will be embedded in the submucosa, not the mucosa. The mucosa is made up of epithelial lining and what we call lamina propria of loose connective tissue. It doesn't contain glands. But the area which you are going to find glands made of dense irregular connective tissue is what we call the submucosa. And they will be, one striking thing about the tongue is that these glands will be somewhere between skeletal muscle fibers running in different directions. I'll show you in another slide. Skeletal muscle fibers running in different directions, and embedded or somewhere between them or interspersed within them, we have these glands. These glands are nothing but mucous glands. Of course, these ducts are here. They are having short ducts because it's found in the oral cavity to open over there. Okay, so that is, what I want you to know. So there we are. As I was showing you now, you can see that these ones are deeply stained glands over here, which they are finding themselves in skeletal muscle fibers running in different directions. Very important, running in different directions. And that is the characteristic feature that you find over here. Now, this one specifically was taken at the vicinity of what we call the circumvent papillae, okay? And these ones are known as what we call the von Ebner's glands. Okay, so good. So now we want to review these primary papillae that I'm talking about. And the first one I want to talk about is what we call the circumvallate, or simply the vallate papillae. And we said that vallate papillae lie just anterior to what we call the sulcus terminalis. Okay, the V-shaped sulcus that we find over there. Now, what we see is that, so there we are, that is, that one. You see, one thing that you have to know is that this one, you can see it is having, you can see that this papillae is having the epithelial pegs, okay, because stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. The epithelial pegs are invading the vicinity of the territory of the connective tissue that underlies it, and then the connective tissue also invades it, forming this kind of connective tissue papillae that you find over here. Yes, that's one thing. Now, one thing that I want you to also know is that we have these large trenches around over here. Along the lateral wall, we have these large trenches. Now, the reason is that we have taste bars within this epithelial lining of the circumvallate papillae. There are taste bars over there, and the taste bars are located on the lateral wall of what we call the this circumvallate papillae, or something I call the stalks of these circumvallate papillae. And these large trenches or these moats or these clefts that we find over here, okay, along this area, just around over there, we have serous glands. Okay, in the vicinity of these glands, we have serous glands, and these serous glands are given special name. It has an eponym known as von Ebner's glands, and these von Ebner's glands will make secretions to come in here, so that at the end of the day, already tasted chemical can be washed away for new one to be tasted. So these, taste buds, okay, will be able to sense the new taste that is coming, because the already tasted one would have been washed by these von Ebner's glands. So that is one thing that you have. Now, one thing is that some people may describe this one as being mushroom shaped, although I'm not talking about fungiform papillae, but some people may describe it as being mushroom shaped. Yes, you can take it like that. But one thing I want you to know is that these epithelial pecs that you find over here, they are shallower, okay, or they are less longer, and then again the connective tissue papillae which invades, they are also less deeper, so to speak. But the striking thing is that we have taste buds on the lateral wall of what we call the circumvallate papillae, or the circumvallate papillae. That is the identifying feature of this one that you have to know. Very simple in that regard. Now the next one that we find, which you have to understand what we call the circumvallate papillae, you have to understand these epithelial pecs and epithelial connective papillae to be able to distinguish between them. And that one is what we call the foliate papillae. Now guys, foliate papillae, one thing that you find is that you can see that I would say that they are relatively N-shaped. They are N-shaped in nature, and they form this kind of series along over there. Can you see that? It's forming that kind of series. But one thing that you find over here is that you can see the epithelial pecs are moving very deep in there. The epithelial pecs, they are invading the vicinity of the connective tissue very deep, and then the connective tissue papillae also invades very deep. Okay, so that is one thing that we are seeing. But again, on the lateral walls, we are having these taste buds, and these taste buds are what we call, yes, they are located on the lateral walls over here. That's one thing you find. So we don't only have taste buds on the lateral walls for circumvallate papillae, but also on the foliate papillae, we are having taste buds along the lateral walls. But one other thing too that you find, the distinguishing feature, the striking distinguishing feature, is that these epithelial pecs, okay, in the case of the foliate, they are very deep, very long, and the connective tissue papillae are also very deep. So that's the distinguishing feature. Very simple in that regard. Okay, so that is one thing that you find. But the interesting thing is that this one, you don't really have it in adult human beings. Yes, in infants you may find them there, but also in lower animals, we are like dogs, we are going to find this kind of foliate papillae very abundant over there. So the next one that we talk about is what we call the fungiform papillae. Yes, the one which you can really describe as being mushroom shaped. But one thing that is striking over here, because mushroom, yes, the crown over there, okay, the superior portion, that is where the taste buds are located. So yes, of course, you have what you call the epithelial pecs, you have connective tissue papillae, and on the crown, okay, or the superior portion of the fungiform papillae, that is where we have what you call the taste buds. And then of course, immediately alongside, lateral to these ones, we are going to find what we call the filiform papillae. But what I want you to know is that this one, which is presented with this dome shape, okay, on what we call the anterior to test of the dorsum of the tongue, yes, it's having a taste buds in the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium on its crown, on its superior portion. Okay, so that is what I want you to actually know, not along the lateral wall, because along the lateral wall, the only primary papillae that we are going to find, taste buds along the lateral walls, yes, will be the circumvallate papillae, and then of course will be that of the foliate. The fungiform will have a taste buds on its crown. So the last primary papillae, okay, papilla that I talk about is what we call the filiform papilla. Now, filiform papilla, yes, the shape is what you call conical in nature. Okay, these slender-like structures that you find, and these ones are going to be keratinized. They will not be non-keratinized, they will be keratinized. So they will have what we call stratified squamous keratinized epithelium, and because they are keratinized, we don't have any taste buds in what we call the epithelial lining. Okay, no taste buds in the epithelial lining, and that is why to be having this kind of mechanical rule, helping in that kind of creating that friction as we chew food, in the mouth. So that is, that one that we find. So what have we seen? What we've seen is that on the anterior 2/3 of the dorsum of the tongue, not the posterior 1/3, not the ventral aspect, we have what we call the primary papillae of the tongue. And these primary papillae, yes, the identifying feature is that one, whether it is having stratified squamous, keratinized or non-keratinized epithelium. And what we've seen is that 3 of them will have stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelium, namely the circumvallate papilla, the foliate papilla, and the fungiform. Okay, the only odd one is the filiform papilla, because that one is keratinized epithelium, stratified squamous, keratinized epithelium. Now again, apart from that, we look at the location. Those on which are non-keratinized will have taste bars, and therefore we have to look at location of the taste bar to distinguish between them. Now, if the taste bars is found in the epithelial lining of the crown, okay, the superior portion like this one, okay, then we call it what we call fungiform papilla. Fungiform papilla. Now, if the taste bars is found on the lateral wall of what we call the papilla, that is either called circumvallate papilla or it is called foliate papilla. Now, then how do you distinguish between circumvallate papilla and foliate papilla? We said that we look at the deep, how deep these epithelial pecs are, or how deep the connective papillae are. In the case of shallow epithelial pecs and connective papillae, then we know that we are looking at circumvallate papilla. Yes, very simple. And then in case we are seeing the epithelial pecs and connective papillae to be very deep, then we are looking at the foliate papilla. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you find this one helpful. Yes, we will continue with some of these ones and review all these ones in our future exciting videos. So please, if you've not subscribed to the channel, please do so that you can have a good time with us. Have a good night, all of you, and may God richly bless you. Amen.